The 1967 court case of Loving v. Virginia, which legalized interracial marriage across the U.S., created a new frontier for interracial love and racial equality. It enabled the children of these marriages to have legal representation and allowed the adults access to benefits like Social Security and insurance, dramatically changing the quality of their lives.
Richard Loving, a white man, was born in 1933. He was then followed by Mildred Jader, a black woman, in 1939. The two were born and raised in Caroline County, Virginia. Despite their races and the viewpoints of their time and place, they fell in love and had a child with each other. On June 2nd, 1958, Mildred and Richard were married. Due to the fact that interracial marriage was at the time illegal in Virginia, they went out of state to Washington, D.C. for this. They then returned to their home state of Virginia as husband and wife. On July 11th, 1958, they were arrested. The police came into their home and found them in bed together. They were then taken to jail. The two of them were in violation of Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws, more specifically the 1924 New Virginia Law to Preserve Racial Integrity. This law was put into place to prevent the mixture of races. Miscegenation, the mixture of races, was seen by specific officials as a great issue. To quote Dr. Walter Plecker, the author of the law, "This bill aims at correcting a condition that only the more thoughtful people of Virginia know the existence of. It is estimated that there are in the state from 10,000 to 20,000 near white people who contain an intermixture of colored blood. In some cases, to a slight extent, this is true, but still enough to prevent them from being white." Plecker then goes on to list definitions for what classifies a colored person, as well as terms used to classify mixed people. Essentially, this law wasn't focused on a superior skin color, due to the fact that some mixed people were known to appear white, but rather the belief that the blood of non-white people was basically impure in some way. Plecker stated that, to succeed, the intermarriage of white race with mixed stock must be made impossible. But that is not sufficient, so public sentiment must be aroused so that intermixture out of wedlock will cease. The public must be led to look with scorn and contempt upon the man who will degrade himself and do harm to society with such abhorrent deeds. Plecker's views were that couples like the Lovings somehow did harm to society, not only by their marriage but by the act of mixing their genetics. The court ruled that the Lovings would either be sentenced to 1 year in jail or have to leave the state of Virginia, not returning together for another 25 years. With no other choice, Mildred, Richard, and their son Sidney moved out of their home state of Virginia to Neal Street, Washington, D.C., to stay with cousins of Mildred.
In 1963, the Lovings attempted to have their charges dropped, despite it being 4 years since they were charged. The Lovings were referred to lawyer Bernard S. Cohen. They proceeded to ask the court to set aside the sentences for Mildred and Richard.
At the end of the case, Judge Leon M. Basil decided not to drop the charges. It was on that day, the 22nd of January, 1965, that he delivered his infamous quote, saying, "Almighty God created the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. And but for the interference with this arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix." This quote provided just the motivation and reason for the Lovings to continue fighting. In May of 1966, the Lovings appealed to the Supreme Court with Loving v. Virginia. In the case, they sued the Commonwealth of Virginia and presented 5 main questions. The main question overall here was whether the laws prohibiting interracial marriage were against the Constitution. This included parts of the 14th Amendment. Verbal arguments were heard by the Supreme Court on April 10, 1967. Philip J. Hirschkopf, who had become involved in the case a few months after Bernard S. Cohen, delivered the opening argument.
Mr. Chief Justice, Associate Justice, may it please the Court. We will divide the argument accordingly. I will handle the equal protection argument as we view it, and Mr. Cohn will argue the due process argument. You have before you today what we consider the most odious of the segregation laws and the slavery laws. And our view of this law, and we hope to clearly show, is that this is a slavery law.
Attorney Robert D. McIlwain argued for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Mr. Chief Justice, may it please the Court, as an Assistant Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Virginia, I appear as one of counsel for the appellee in support of the judgment of the Supreme Court of Appeals of our state affirming the constitutional validity of the two statutes which are involved in this case. In view of what has been said before, it may not be inappropriate at this point to emphasize that there are only two statutes before this court for consideration, Section 20-58 and 20-59 of the Virginia Code.
The full verbal arguments lasted about 2 hours and 16 minutes. On June 12, 1967, the court case was decided. Shockingly, all 9 of the participating Supreme Court justices agreed to the Lovings argument. They voted in unanimous yes. Following the case, Richard and Mildred went to the office of their lawyers to answer press questions. As the office was in Alexandria, the Lovings now made their way to Virginia as a couple for the first time since 1959. When asked, "How does it feel?" Richard responded with, "It feels hard to believe. For the first time, I can put my arm around her and publicly call her my wife." Richard and Mildred remained in their home in Caroline County, Virginia for the rest of their lives. Though Richard sadly died at age 41 in a drunk driving accident, he and his wife Mildred went on to have 2 more children, Donald and Peggy. Mildred later passed away of pneumonia in 2008. In regards to the Lovings' legacy, a 2015 study shows that 17% of American newlyweds were intermarried. These couples could now experience the financial benefits of marriage, such as joint tax filing and insurance benefits. A 2020 study shows that multicultural people accounted for 2.8% of the population. We can thank the Lovings, not only for their rights, but also the motivation that they give us. They were pioneers for interracial love. We owe our thanks to them for the majority of those 17% of couples and the 2.8% of our population.